Hello and welcome to this Project in a Box video. This is the third of the series looking at building PPM maturity, and here we're going to be looking at how we can move up beyond the sort of level 3 type scores. In part 1 we introduced you to the PPM maturity model. In part 2 we looked at 3 quick wins that will get you to level 3, and now we're going to look at moving on beyond that. It's actually about 18 months or so since we recorded the second session, and that's often the sort of timescale at which people might be thinking, having established their level 3, to move on again. So this is actually quite a sort of logical time to do this. So we're just going to recap 1 and 2 very quickly and then jump on to 3. So the P3M3 model, obviously go back and look at the detail at the video, which is up here on the card in the corner, if you want to see the full detail. But broadly, we've got 3 different models, 7 different perspectives. Each of them is scored against a set of criteria, and the results of that give you a score. And it averages out over those various areas to give you a total indicated level of where you are, and you can see what you're stronger and weaker in various different areas. You can self-assess, or you can have somebody in to assess for you. We looked in the second session at how Project in a Box can help you get to level 3 quickly with some quick wins, and we grouped those into 3 areas: consistency, controls and communication. So consistency was about standardizing the way you chose to deliver your projects using what we call a method template. We've got a load of those available straight off the shelf for you to use in different methodologies for different types of projects, and they establish all the materials that you need to deliver a project in a consistent manner, as well as setting up all the reporting and control structures for those. And that's a real benefit in terms of making sure that you're getting all those materials out in front of people. There's a consistent manner to it all, and it's just guiding people through that process. The second one was about establishing a strong controls culture. So each of your methods will have plans, risks and issues, registers within them, benefits and finances and other such things. You're collecting that data automatically as people update those files in the system, and all that's centralized for you to make it available for analysis and reporting and decision making support, etc. Tools to help support audit and all that other sort of good stuff as well. So off the shelf, all that material that you need, and often a lot of what your PMO doing is trying to handle all that sort of stuff, number crunching it in spreadsheets, so doing all that for you. Communications is about helping to get that information out to appropriate people. That's by notifications and email exchange, which a system can do for you. Reporting, producing standardized reports as well, which a system can do for you. And then putting in place the structures that you might use to start to establish best practice, to collect lessons learned material, etc. Approvals processes, the sort of things that you might start to mature into. So using all these 3 areas, this is a typical sort of result that our customers see. Customers have been self-assessing and having external assessments done after they've implemented Project in a Box, and generally finding that they're around the 3 marks. Some are slightly over, some are slightly under, but are basically around the sort of 3 marks. That's a fairly typical sort of assessment that you would get after implementing Project in a Box with the key areas we've just been talking about. So now we want to talk about what takes us beyond level 3. So those 3 things, consistency, communication, controls, take us typically to a level 3. And actually that will then, really, to move beyond that, a key thing is going to be bedding all that in, because a lot of the changes beyond that come partly from culture change, and that's not an instant thing. That's never an instant thing. It takes a while to do that. So the pattern we often find is that people will jump straight to that sort of level 3 by implementing all that off-the-shelf stuff, and then they'll roll through it through a cycle of projects for a year, 18 months, perhaps 2 years, depending on the sort of projects they're running and the cycles, periodicity, etc. of those. And then they'll start to think about the next things that they can build on top of that once all that's locked in, and start to move on. So we've identified 3 areas again: personalizing, people, and prioritizing. So these are quite generic areas, but we're going to pick out some particular things within each of those and go and look at them in some more detail. So firstly, prioritizing. Demand management. So a key part of moving into 4s and 5s is to think about whether you are not just managing the process but optimizing it. Are you doing the right projects, not just doing projects right? And so demand management, managing a funnel of ideas, is important in that. Data and trends, even if you can't measure it, you can't manage it. So collecting the right data that you're going to need. Building on from the standard data collection models that we have to personalize it to your own data models, and also building in trends. So as you've been collecting that data for a while, you'll have trend analysis on that, which helps you make decisions as well. So that's a key thing there. So the next area is mobility, and this really transitions between people and prioritizing, as we're going to cover when we go through it in detail. Straight in the people section, we've got resource demand. So looking at the level of demand for individuals and teams, groups of people across all of your projects rolled up, and that's the sort of thing people often think they're going to be able to do down here, but generally it comes in a cleaner, more usable way once you've got that consistency bedded into your controls and you're collecting all the plans for all the projects, and they're being resourced appropriately. And it can take a while to get people to the stage where they're doing that so that you can then make use of that resource demand capability. Often people are also starting to deepen what they do now, so they'll be collecting more once they've got over the sort of firefighting of actually making sure their projects are on track and running and things aren't going badly wrong. They start to think about the value adds like stakeholder management, so they're putting that sort of content in, thinking about that, collecting data about it, managing it, monitoring it, doing all those things a bit better. Lessons and reviews. Now this is a really important area. We've got it sat straddling people and personalizing because it's a people process. The lessons don't automatically appear. You have to get people to record them. You have to have reviews with people and organisations and groups and stakeholders to make sure you know what's going on and what's going badly and what's going well, and feeding that back. But it feeds back through the personalising area. So personalising process. Our standard off-the-shelf processes are generic. They're not absolutely right for everybody. They're a really good starting point. But to really make them work well, you need to personalise them to match what you're doing. Your types of projects, your types of documentation, the issues you come across in your organisation, depending on where you are in the development and the culture of all these things. And again, collecting appropriate data so that you can measure it and manage it and report it and communicate and share it. And obviously, if I could draw a diagram which linked back on itself, the data and reporting would link through both of these areas here. So there's lots of interconnected elements within all this, much more so than we had in a relatively simple section down the bottom. But really, you'd struggle to do a load of these things early on. It's about building on top of that really solid structure of consistency, good controls collection, established communication approaches. So let's go and pick out these and have a look through them in some more detail then. So focusing on prioritising first, we're going to talk about demand management. So often people early on will run our standard methods, which are, I've got a project, create a project of this type, start running it. As people mature, what they often do is look at the demand side. So they say, well, I've got an idea for a project. In fact, I've got 100 ideas for projects that we might do. Let's collect some information about them so we can compare and rank them and then decide which ones we're going to do. And so you can have built into your process that element. And so we have a standard method actually that you can use so you can start to explore that quite early on, which is demand management process. It has only one process available initially, project concept, which is an expanded sort of project concept over our standard one, which includes data collection around idea. You've got some questionnaires to fill out to score and rate the idea. You collect evidence and support of that. You do some sort of benefits assessment. That data then is able to be compared against all the other ideas, and you can identify which ones you want to do. It's not always a logical thing. The system doesn't just work out which ones, but it's about presenting a more rational set to the decision makers who can then apply their political judgments on top of that about which ones may need a bit bumping up or bumping down depending on the circumstances of the organisation. So being able to do that in a much more structured way, and that data not then being lost to you because that idea then converts into a live project. So you can go back and compare it. It's included in the reporting later on. You can see how accurate you were. That's a key part of learning lessons that we're going to talk about later, feeding that back into the process, making sure you make the right decisions. Data and trends. So like I say, if you can't measure it, you can't manage it. So collecting the right sort of data and managing that over time. So this is a fairly typical sort of report that you'd start to find useful over a period of time because it's about trend analysis. When you first create your project, you've got no trend. as your project develops, you can look back and see how you're comparing against delivery date against baseline date. Are the risks and issues updating or increasing or declining in the way that you might expect? What's the budget doing in comparison to the expected spend? All those sorts of things. So you can do that much better over a period of time, and you'll also be working with the data that's appropriate for you. So you may well start to create some new data streams. We'll talk a bit more about that later as well. And that's not just numbers data, but it can be statuses and commentaries. All the things actually that you collect as project data points are trended for you, so you can go back and look at the earlier versions of that. And we have some typical charts for doing things like, status trend analysis, which is really quite a popular thing to be able to do. The next thing is mobility. So this is quite an interesting one, actually. This isn't something we necessarily thought of, but this is what our customers tell us is a big advantage of the system once they've got it developed and up and running and they're confident about it. So most organizations have a relatively limited pool of what they might call, top-notch project managers and key resources like planners and cost engineers and all those sorts of things. And especially, young organizations, and here we're talking about people moving through that maturity scale. And it's not possible to just add a new resource like that. People need training, they need experience, they need confidence to be able to do these things. So they don't grow on trees, brand new project managers. So you need to sometimes be able to move them about. Now, in the past, people would say that wasn't very easy to do because you move somebody from one project to another. Well, it'll take them 2 months to get up to speed on the new project because the data is all spread. It's not really consistent. The documentation isn't easily accessible. So a lot of it's in the project manager's head. Somebody leaves, for example, it's a real problem for that project. That's not so much the case once you've got a good, consistent base system in place, because here are two projects. This is the view of two projects in the system. They're both mid-complexity projects. One's near its end and the other one's near its start. But actually, if you're a project manager used to using a system like this, you can very easily find out what's going on and where all the information is from one project to another, because they're the same. They use the same consistent set of processes, the same documentation structure. You'll be able to use search within there to go and find particular things you're interested in. If you want to see the latest plan or how the plan's developed or the risk or issue registers, it'll all be the same. You'll click in the same places to get that information. It'll all be available because it's all been audit trailed for you. So you can pick up a new project and move projects very easily. And customers have told us that that's exactly what they've done. Once a project is in flight and proceeding in a good way, they can take the project manager off that and move them to start up a new project or to go and firefight a project that's gone wrong. And so you can that's hard work for that project manager, and sometimes people only learn by failure, but you can make that choice. You have the ability then to move people around, and that's really quite a useful thing that people have struggled with in the past. That comes on the basis of having all that consistency and control stuff in place. So moving into the people area now, mobility is very much a people issue. So we've just covered that already. Now we'll talk about resource demand. So, actually, resource demand is built into the system fundamentally. As soon as you add a plan for your project, it's reading that data into the central database, and it's able to produce resource charts for you, showing you where particular users or groups or collections of users have been allocated to tasks. Experience, though, tells us that new organisations and people in the lower maturity levels don't really resource their plans particularly well or consistently or sometimes at all, and therefore and certainly not new ideas. So it might be current projects that are resourced but not resource indications for future projects. So you don't have a clear enough picture really to be able to use that information properly. As people mature, and you're getting some clearer space because the routine stuff's been done for you by a system. You've got a bit more time to focus on things like that. You can get your plans resourced nicely. you can make sure that the data has been collected consistently. It's always the same person and name that's used, or they're tied together to users in the system. There's a way of doing all that, such that you have resource information which is usable. So here and then you can see that depending on your permissions. So here at the top in the red, I can see my resource chart in the system for a couple of months, and I can see all the projects that I'm allocated to, and what the demand for my time is. And I can see actually it's not particularly high at the moment, but later in the month, or later next month, I've got a peak which I'm not going to be able to meet. And so users can go away and do that themselves, and that's really useful. They're not having to go and rely on somebody else to do it. They can take ownership of that. And that's a cultural thing again, but it gives them the ability to do that. But you can then move from beyond that. So that's, of course, one person across the whole system. Moving beyond that to looking at a group of people. So here in the bottom, we're looking at a group of people. These are a collection of users from the system who all have the same characteristic. So we have this ability of tagging users with information. So you can tag users with their typical role, with their skills, with their locations, with other information as well. And then you can search that database, that skill database if you like, when you're doing resource analysis. So I've come into here and I've looked for all people that are team members or all people that are project managers. In fact, here it's team members, all team members. All tasks in the entire system for all team members. And this is the sort of thing a resource manager might do, a department manager might do. And they can see, coming from all the different projects, this is the typical demand level. And I've appeared in here as well. I'm orange in this particular chart. And I can see that although, as we can see here, I had quite a lot of things to do later in the month, actually that's not a particular problem because the rest of the team members don't have very much to do. So we can therefore rejig those tasks and allocate them to other people. So it's really useful like this. I've been able to look at a combined picture. And I had some free time back here, but maybe I could have picked up some tasks that other people were doing. So we can start to even that sort of thing out, and we can look at that in detail and see exactly what that requirement is. Like I say, being able to do that requires and make reasoned, rational decisions based off all of that information requires good data in, rubbish out, classic thing. But as we mature, we're collecting better data, we can look at those sorts of things. So that's a really useful thing to be able to do. Next, we're talking about stakeholder stats, and I was saying about deepening the process. Once you've got the sort of basics, you've got controls being done well, you've got things have been specified, you're setting mandates and PIDs, and work packages have been documented, and change management's happening, and all those sort of things which are the core of project management are being done. Then you've got a bit of time to focus perhaps on some of the things that are really going to make your projects successful, but which are often seen as a bit of, well, nice to haves. So stakeholder management, and people are probably shouting at this point, but that's the real world. Stakeholder management is very important, and if you're managing your stakeholders, dealing with the people that are actively involved in the project and the wider community, and listening to what they want and satisfying them and communicating with them, you'll have a much smoother project. You'll know about problems earlier on. You'll be able to address things perhaps where you've got time to do that, rather than at the last minute where it's going to cost you more money and cost you time. Much smoother, better run project. So you'll be able to manage that. So here's a couple of examples of that sort of thing in action. In our plan, we've got items, set up milestones or tasks for stakeholder activities. Our plan might have 500 activities in it, but we can focus in on that because we're running a filter in our analysis which allows us to go and get all stakeholder related issues or items. We can see when they're happening, have they happened in our milestone timeline. Here we've got some red ones that haven't happened, some green ones that have. Or we can do a more detailed analysis which looks at what's actually descriptions and comments around those, and get some detail. So we can go in and manage that as an active process using the same tools we've been using for all the other things. We could be collecting other sorts of statistics around stakeholders. So often people have a stakeholder map, They'll have a spreadsheet perhaps of activities that are going on. They can be producing stats and data around that, which can be managed and going into reports. I mean, these blocks, these analyses can be appearing in reports, a stakeholder review, for example, as part of your standard project report. Those sort of things are worth doing, like I say, when you're maturing. And they really help you add to those higher scores again. Lessons and reviews. This one we said sort of links across between people and personalizing. I mentioned at the very back or first section when we talked about communications, the things that are getting us up to level 3, that we have a standard lessons learned library approach built into the system. This enables you to store in one place or to share into one place all the lessons learned logs, end project reports, and if you want to, risk and issue registers, other really valuable sources of information, into the one place. In that place, they're then available, view only, to be searched by whoever you give access to. So you're building up a really big library of content around lessons, things that went well and didn't go so well in the project. People then come in and search. They can search for particular terms, and it'll return all the references to those within that documentation library. So you can go in and do your own lessons research. You haven't had to do anything particularly to do that. As you set up each new project, you just link its content into that library. The system does all the indexing and the search and returning of results. And yes, if you want to, you can hide certain things. Again, it's a cultural issue, whether you're going to hide things or not. But anyway, yes, you can make it available. You can also hide things to different levels of users. So assembling all that information and then reading into it and finding the useful stuff out. But that, of course, takes time because, until it's built up a bit of a bulk, you're not getting that much back out. So that happens really nicely over time. But you can also customize your processes to help you do this. So all of our standard methods, I think, have a lessons learned or end project report form. You want to set up reviews. Organisations often will go into a mode where they have a post-project review, an actual sit-down meeting for certain projects, perhaps projects that have gone particularly well or particularly badly, and collect further information, but at least an end project report where the project manager is giving their opinion on some of that sort of stuff. A really important thing, though, is about feeding lessons back into new projects. Now, the things I've just talked about, that accessing the lessons learned library requires somebody to go and do that. But something that works really well that customers are doing is to take lessons. This is a typical sort of PMO type role or head of projects type role. And they review the lessons on a 6-monthly annual basis. And they turn those key lessons into potential risks for future projects. So that's what happens. In the real world, we're taking a lesson that a supplier went bust, and it caused us a delay. If we think about that, that becomes a risk on the next similar project where we've got a supplier, and we think about what happens if they go bust. That's a potential risk. So that's the sort of logical chain, and so therefore, rather than just shipping a new empty risk register to each project, why not ship a risk register which is pre-populated with the most common or most significant risks from lessons that have happened in previous projects? Now, that's a sort of cultural change, but it's a really, really useful one, because then it's almost like a checklist. People are going through and going, well, that one's not relevant to me, that one's not relevant, oh, that one is. And it might also include some pre-configured responses. What are the really useful things to be able to do? What are our stock responses to that? That's all about learning, measuring, improving, feeding back, optimizing our projects. Optimizing, that's really what we want to do. That gets us to level 5 because we're learning from those things, we're feeding them back, and we're making sure that that's fed forward in quite a forceful way because these are important issues. So that's not the sort of thing that people do as a continual thing, but often it's done on a 6-monthly or annual basis, and people are feeding that information forward. And then, of course, you can have review reports. So this is actually a daily Scrum type report. So that's a review that's happening on a daily basis. That's what that method does. But you can have annual review reports and monthly ones that look at trends and latest stats and bring everything together based on what you're supposed to do, what your process says you're supposed to look at, brings all that data into one place so that it forms a nuclei around which you can have those meaningful conversations with all the data there. It's not a review meeting when somebody says, oh, I'm not sure, I've got to go and find that out, because the stuff's all there. And it's quite an open way of looking at it. So lessons and reviews, very, very important, and really comes into its own based off of consistency and controls. So personalization, lessons and reviews, yes, we just talked about that. We're going to talk about process now, and this is quite a big area. So, a key part of that consistency message about stuff to get us to level 3 quickly was we've got a whole load of different method templates. It's now 13 different standard methods. You can just pick them up and use them straight away. And many, many customers will use the materials straight away. They'll off the shelf our standard methods straight up and running, and that's really useful because, like I say, they're pretty good. It's an 80-20 type thing. They're pretty good at meeting most sort of generic project management requirements, and you'll get through a few cycles of using those, and there's a sort of family of them: the end step 1, 3, 4, 5 methods, praxis, prince 2, PPP for proposals, DSDM a turn, praxis, etc. So a range of different types of methods, but you can use them straight off the shelf immediately. Now, as you go through those cycles, project team members are going to be going, oh, well, that's not quite right for my project, so I'll add some extra things, and that's not quite right for this sort of project, so I'll take a bit away. And after you've been through a few cycles of that, you get a really good feel for actually what's much better optimized for the sorts of projects that we're doing. That might be one person's doing an IT project and one person's doing an office move type project, and they're different sorts of project, so they have different content. Or it might be, well, we work in a particular industry sector, and therefore there's some particular sector relevant materials that we need to use, and processes. So we have people personalising these things for things like REBA when they work in the construction sector, because that's the architect's standard for how to do building work. So those are the processes you want to be following, and you merge your project management documentation into that. So taking these standard ones and personalizing them for your own needs. And so there's a whole load of examples of that. Here's a set which has been personalized relatively lightly by a hospital. The processes are broadly the same as the ones that we use, but they've chosen which project levels are appropriate for the sorts of things they're doing. And what they've then done is change the documentation that's in them. So they've got more service management and IT security type documentation into that standard project, because that's the sort of projects that they're doing. So they can build in that. They can also customize, of course, the reporting structures into that. So the button they press runs a different report perhaps to the one that our standard method would do, and that report is optimized to the things that they need to have in their reports. This is one which is customized a bit further. So this has again 2 different projects, because we always find this, it's scaled. No organization runs all of their projects from the same method. Systems that are built that has a way of doing projects, it just never really works, because projects are projects, they're unique, and yes, you might be able to group them around some sort of nodes, so you might have 2 or 3 different nodes, but one, it's just unrealistic. So one way of doing projects is never quite right. A number of ways of doing projects is much more likely to be right. So this one is 2. There's a much more substantial project management framework for bigger, more complex projects, and very small projects, project on a page. It's one document. It's a spreadsheet actually, which controls all the project information. It's got a very basic risk and issue management, finances management, plan, key dates, milestones, etc. And that was their own thing. They had that before they bought Project in a Box. But that was about putting their stuff into Project in a Box, using our frameworks, collecting data through it, being able to analyze and report on that alongside the big projects. So personalising that really quite a lot to match what it is that they want to do. The next one is a process which is heavily gated. So this is again a customized project. They've got a couple of flavors of this actually, again for different sizes of project, but this is just one of them. This is a major project, has a whole load of gated processes. You can't move on to the next one until you've been approved for completion of the stage you're currently on. So it's got detailed layout of the documentation that's going to happen in each particular place, and then sign off and approval allows you to proceed on to the next process step. That's all built in. It's got different analysis, different reports here, reports for gates. So again, a bit like a review report, you've got a project sort of progress type report button that runs a standard templated report, or you've got one which is a gate report, which is like a review. The documentation approved, what's people signed off, etc., to enable us to decide whether we're going to proceed beyond the gate or not. Because those decisions are not built in some logical way. It's a decision and a setting that's changed in the system to move gates, and normally that's done by assessing the situation and then deciding how to proceed, because otherwise you're building some logical process flow, and then something urgent needs to be done on a project. People are prepared to override that logical flow because something needs to be done quickly, but then the system's holding you back. So that's not the case here. You can bypass all those things if you want to and just flip it over to the next stage, but that'll have to be done based on a logical decision and a recorded audit trail activity to do that. You don't just have to line up and fakely approve all the documentation and set values to certain levels to enable the gates to be tripped. Hopefully that makes sense. Data and reporting. So here we sort of looped all the way back round to when we're talking about data and trends in prioritizing at the very beginning. So we're going to focus in a little bit more on the nitty-gritty of data. So I've picked an area here which is the idea information that we collect in the demand management process. I don't want to show particular customers' personalizations for data here because that's often quite personal. So focusing in on idea management. So we have, in this particular case, a spreadsheet questionnaire which you can customize to be whatever you want to, which is sat in that early concept phase of the project. As people are working on that, updating it, adding information, every time they check it in, we read data out of that and put it in our database. Now that just doesn't happen magically. That's set up in the spreadsheet, and there's a thing that controls that, and that's built into the method, so it's set up the same for every project of this type. It knows there's an idea information spreadsheet, and out of that it's going to bring a whole load of stats. They can be numbers, they can be text, they can be strings, etc. And it's also going to bring out of that some images, some charts and things like that. And so that means that we can use all that for reporting, and that just happens automatically. Every new project of this type has a template like that. As soon as the project's created, it'll read out a load of blank data, but then as you start to fill it in, it starts to populate and feed through. And so when I'm running my report here, which is my ideas statement across the full set of ideas, I can see the statuses of them and values and descriptions, etc. And they can be ordered in some way, and I can compare them, and I can then go to project specific statements. So this is the statement for first project, and this is the statement for the next project, and this is another one here which we can spread out a little bit so we can see a bit more detail of it. But you can do these sorts of things, you can do them yourself from spreadsheets in your projects, and that's really useful. Typically people are collecting data like this for finances, which is always personalized, it's never generic. Benefits, which is highly customized because some people are not doing it at all, some people are doing it really well, and again, as you mature, you might not be doing it to start off with, but as you mature through that, you probably do start to collect benefits information because it's really useful for managing idea process, etc. And it's that classic, are we doing the right project as well as doing the project well? So benefits, finances, idea, health and safety, and then all sorts of technical domain data as well. You might be also collecting, I think as we said earlier, stakeholder type stats, number of meetings, number completed on time, all those sorts of different things using this sort of mechanism. So you decide what it is you want to collect, how you send it to the system, and then how you choose to report on it at project levels and at multi-project levels. You can also collect data from a more traditional database type structure. So here we've got something which is our database of data. We've got some process management steps in here, which people generally start to use over a period of time. So we've got our generic process steps: idea, startup, delivery, close out. And the project manager can come in here and decide what the statuses are for each of these. Now this is completely generic. You can manage that. You can choose the entries that are going to be there. Some of these things can be text fields or date fields or number fields. You decide what it is you want to collect. So people are often starting to add some structure to their system by collecting things like departments or programs or corporate objective alignment. That sort of information collected here means that you can then use that to display. So here we've got a display of a load of projects in a portfolio or program, and we can see what statuses they're at the various points using exactly this information here. But that information can be used to so projects can be grouped into programs or portfolios, groups of projects which are either all in the same alignment, they're in the same technical area, they're in the same department, they're all being finished next month, all those sorts of things. You can manually group those things together, but you can also have them grouped together by the system. So the system can assemble a portfolio for you automatically of all the projects in a particular department. Now, if that department is a figure that is something that you type in, and somebody puts A&E and somebody else puts accident and emergency, they won't group together. So having this sort of better structure, pick listing things, means that works much better. So you can produce rules, around all that sort of stuff, which drive that assembly of things. So commonly people are looking for projects with overdue deliveries, over budget projects, things like that, or projects that are within a certain percentage of their spend levels. So you can look for things like that, which is really helpful in terms of managing that process, optimizing which projects you're doing, etc. So collecting the right data, grouping it really well. So a lot of things we've been talking about here have been project things, but of course all that controls and data and resource analysis is about going up through programs and portfolios and higher levels of data manipulation and grouping. And these groupings are really important, obviously, for program and portfolio levels of operation. And so reporting wise, you're not just reporting on project levels, but you can report on multi-project levels, and these are those groupings that we use. So here's a dashboard. I'm looking at a particular portfolio here, a collection of projects. These are the projects in that portfolio. This is the analysis for them on the right hand side. That just happens because they're in that portfolio. Like I say, you can do those groupings based on rules or just a manual grouping of projects, and then you can report at those levels, sort of what we've got here, but you can also report against collections of those levels. So in my portfolio list down here, I've got some portfolios associated with ideas. One is all the ideas, one is all the approved ideas, one is all the idea pool not yet approved, for example. I've also got my projects grouped by department, which department they're operating in, and I've got them grouped by program as well, where I've got active programs running. I've got that collection of projects. Now that means that a project can exist in multiple different places, multiple portfolios, and I need to be able to report on all that and manage that, and perhaps to compare my portfolios as well. So this is what we call a multi-portfolio report over here. This is comparing and then combining the different three programs. I've got a new facilities, a Windows 10 rollout, and a manufacturing program. And I can see how many projects are running in each, what their statuses are, what the benefits values of them are, some stats around them, etc., the riskiness of them. All those things rolled up and managed to the top level, which allows me to be much better optimized for my program and portfolio level models, and then doing similar things for finances and for plans and other sorts of areas. So I can take that data and do with it as I wish at multiple levels up through the system. And you could do that, on day one of as soon as you implement it back 2 years ago, when we started doing our 3 simple things. But in practice, most of the time back there, you are busy getting the fundamentals, the project stuff lined up. And once that's happy and working, and you can then start thinking about grouping these things, you can then do all these other things, which is why we say they come later. They build on top of fundamentally strong foundations. If your projects are not being run consistently, you're not collecting data consistently, and different people are collecting different things in different projects, and they're using different metrics and calculations for how they collect them, then you've got no chance at adding it all up and analysing it at program and portfolio levels. It's just not going to happen. You're going to have to do it all back to basics with a spreadsheet, and it's going to take a long time. This is all live based on latest data. It's doing all that rolling up for you, and it can do that because you've got a really strong foundation, fundamentally consistent data collection further down the system. So I've laboured that point quite heavily, but it's a really, really important point. Don't build on weak foundations. It's a waste of time. So we talked about 3 a lot, and now we're talking here about 4 more. So I just want to pick out a few key trends in here. Consistency and time. You can't do these things to level 4 and more straight away. Some organisations can, because they've already got consistent processes. They're collecting their data well, they're nicely structured, and they've spent time. That's because they've already done those things. Most people, they need to get that stuff in place first. So 1 or 2 years of doing all that, so you can get to 3 quite quickly. Taking on to 4 is never a quick step. You need to really pause, make sure that stuff's bedded in really well, and then build on the top of it. Constant change is culturally very difficult. Establish some core things, get those all working really nicely, and then move on. And that's about storming, norming, performing. Constant change isn't great. You want to get all of that consistency stuff in, make sure everyone's running through it, and it becomes just the norm. It's culturally what we do. And once all that's singing, then you can move on to the next stuff, and that's the 4 and more things. Absolutely key part of all this is establishing feedback, making sure the process is managed and then optimized. And again, that comes over time, that understanding of the process and how it works, so that you can then optimize it. You can customize your processes, your data collection, your reporting, because you know what it is that you're doing, and everybody's doing it in the same way. So that's a key thing. Annual review cycles are common. I've mentioned this before already. Sometimes 6 monthly, more commonly annually. So once you've got all this bedded in, your methods, we say methods are fixed in the short term and flexible in the long term. People will generally review their method templates on a 6 monthly or annual basis, and they'll feed back into their method templates the new lessons into the risk registers. They'll put some templates in, they'll change the headings, they'll add some new fields, some new templates, they'll take some away which are not required anymore. They'll review and optimize that stuff every year. The same with the reporting and the data structures. That's the most common way of doing it. And once all that stuff becomes routine and you're saving people time from having to handle churn reports out and look constantly for bits of documentation, and not be able to move project managers around and all that good stuff. Once all that's working, you can deepen and develop your processes. You can start to add the better things that you want to do, like health and safety and stakeholder management and all those good things, better benefits management processes that are really going to see you optimizing and delivering going forwards. But it's about building on the foundations. Measure to manage, you need the right data to be collected in a consistent way so it can be analysed really well. So that's absolutely key thing as well. So really long video, but lots of really useful stuff, and you can't really do it super quick because we're into much more complex areas here. The first video talked about P3M3, the model, why it's there, how it sort of works, and then the quick things to get you to level 3. Then you need to really just double down on all that stuff, make sure it's working properly, it's being done consistently. That becomes a norming and performing type of activity, and then you can go again and you can look at all these extra things which start to take you further on. One tool can do all that. It can take you from nothing to 3 quickly, and then on beyond that. You know, we see people, unfortunately too regularly, who've done nothing and they want to go straight to all these things that they think are brilliant. And they are brilliant, but it's just not possible to go straight to them. You will fail. It's not possible to do it. You need to establish some good, solid foundations first. So that's why we recommend this approach. We're not saying you shouldn't do all these really good things, but it's just not realistic to achieve them straight away. You have to do the simple things, the right things, in the right order. So if you want to talk to us some more about that, we'll be delighted to talk to you. If you haven't seen the first 2 videos, definitely go back and look at those, because you should be looking at those first before you really think about this one. You might think this is a nice, something to aim to, and keep that in your mind, but you really should be doing the other things first. So hope you found that really interesting. Like I say, you want to ask us some more questions, do drop us a line. We'll be delighted to help. Thank you very much.